Teaching gender and sexuality can be both exciting and frustrating. Although we sometimes sense the novelty and the excitement of treading on uncharted territory and the tensions and emotions people experience when they are confronted with the ideas of previously unheard of their worlds, it can also be frustrating because culturally, sexuality is not a topic to be openly discussed, and people sometimes prefer to sit in silence rather than making contribution. Also, teaching sexualities necessitates approaches that encourage people to relax and feel comfortable enough to open up and talk. It can also present the opportunity for critical thinking and exposure of people to alternative viewpoints that they may or might not agree with. How do factors such as culture, religion, and the way we are brought up affect the ways we approach sexuality? Why are there needs to revisit and rethink our views on sexuality? And which steps are there that can be considered and taken into action in order to break the barriers that affect people when talking about sexuality in any field concerned? Good morning. This is just a podcast, and as always, I'm your host with the most. They call me Timothy. And today is when we are coming to an end of our long charted series of African Sexuality by Sylvia Tamale. It has been a nice journey, and it's a nice read. Actually, I've gained some insights and traction for the podcast. And today, mainly, we are going to talk about sexuality in a creative way, in that maybe we talk about the creative approaches surrounding sexuality. In the previous podcast, we were talking about the theories surrounding sexuality, but I thought like we should have African creative approaches that will be talking about sexuality as much as we've delved deeper into sexuality and the history of sexuality, both in a Pan-Africanism manner and in the Western world manner. So I feel like now that we're on the last episodes, we should actually talk about the approaches and the questions for reflections. Tag along. So we have a few questions for reflections as we are finishing this podcast. The first question for reflection that a reader or a listener need to ask themselves is, while living in an African society and finding yourself teaching a course on sexuality in a tertiary institution, in what ways will you utilize the available technology to facilitate your teaching about sexuality? What are your thoughts about the feminist classroom discussed in Sexuality? How helpful is the concept for creating a safe and comfortable climate for teaching about sexuality in the African context? Or what pedagogical methods, content, knowledge, and interpretive tools might be useful for when teaching sexuality effectively? Or which techniques do you encourage students to use when questioning and challenging dominant sexuality discourses and stereotypes? Are there any pedagogical implications for male and female learners? Or you could also ask yourself, what pedagogical language and literary strategies should we employ when teaching sexuality in an African context? Ordinarily, it would have been in place to begin with this section, which contains questions for reflection, with a discussion of history of gender and sexuality or sexuality-related courses as they were taught in African tertiary institutions in the past. But in order to create a context for discourses that follow, where were they located and what was the pedagogic focus? This could not be achieved because it has been possible to access information outside the medical circles on how gender and sexuality courses were taught in the past. Although there is now a growing body of knowledge on contemporary gender and sexuality courses, we can cite a few examples from existing courses, like making reference in gender law and sexuality at the Women Law Center at the University of Zimbabwe. That's one citation. We can also draw another citation from the Africa Gender Institute of Gender and Women Studies in Africa, the GWS Africa Project website, which has a variety of feminist teaching resources, including a section that features an extensive syllabus and bibliography on gender and sexualities in African context. A recent studies, according to a reference, shows that teaching of gender and sexualities in South African higher institution, quote-unquote, Bennett and Reddy 2007, concludes that there are a variety of courses in South African university that take gender and sexuality seriously, and argues that this is a relatively recent phenomenon, overwhelming found in the humanities and health sciences. However, gender and sexuality does not constitute to this. The key areas of knowledge considered necessary for basic understanding of the subject matter include the sexual development, which has sub-branches of biological and physiological. We have the reproductive process, variety of sexual expression. We have the sexual dysfunction and disease. We have the cultural aspects of sex. We have marriage and family. All these are taught in a way that the subject matter cannot possibly reveal that gender is not biologically given and immutable, and that there are gender and power hierarchies that underpin human sexuality. The book does not throw any light on that discourse. A further critique of the nature of the subject matter and its pedagogy will be unfair, considering that the book was published in early 1900s. Therefore, it doesn't take into consideration the approaches that were created afterwards, and it's not consistent. In constructions of gender and sexuality are still being formed, we cannot fully exhaust this book, because some of the ideas expressed in writing in this book are purely thesis or philosophies. So unless they are backed up with facts, we cannot take into consideration and then start teaching at institutions. Of interest is that this book represents one discourse of human sexuality prior to the influence of feminism. I'd love to give out many thanks to the writer of this book, even though she took some stories and compiled them into one big story, Sylvia Samale. She's a professor at the Makerere University. But most of it all, I'd love to give thanks back to Jessica. I call her Trees for Life. If you've been following these sessions, in the first session I introduced her and made sure that you understood my point of view when it came to African sexuality, and she has been a major influence towards these episodes and towards this much traction. So Jessica, wherever you are, I'd love to say thank you, and the listeners and the readers and everybody at large towards making this African Sexuality podcast a success. It couldn't be done without your support. Therefore, this is me here being open and being vulnerable. Either way, I'd love to thank you, and I'd love to say that this is it. We have come to an end of the African Sexuality read. Unless there's another book out there that you think it's important, really important, can reflect more on the African struggles and African tales left untold. Remember, I'd love for you to share it, but that's after the next season we are going to do, and then we can go back to our Red podcast. From the studio, this is Timothy, and I'd like to sign out and see you in the future. Thank you.